She sits in the waiting room of Dr. Edmund Carter's private clinic, hands folded in her lap, trembling slightly despite the oppressive heat of the London summer. Her gloved fingers dig into the fabric of her skirt. Mrs. Adelaide Whitmore has been here before, 3 times in the past month alone, but each visit still carries the weight of shame, though she cannot quite articulate why. The gaslight flickers overhead, casting dancing shadows across the mahogany walls lined with leather-bound medical journals she's never read and doesn't dare touch. Her symptoms had begun subtly. First, the insomnia. Then came the irritability that made her snap at servants over trivial matters, the trembling in her hands during afternoon tea, the suffocating feeling in her chest that made breathing seem like a deliberate act rather than an automatic one. 3 weeks ago, during a social function, she'd experienced what she can only describe as a violent internal disruption, a sudden, convulsive sensation that left her flushed and gasping, requiring her husband to escort her from the drawing room in dignified silence. She'd consulted 2 physicians before Dr. Carter. Both had simply prescribed rest, hydrotherapeutic baths, and various tinctures that left her mouth bitter and her mind foggy. Neither had offered a real diagnosis, let alone a cure. But Dr. Carter was different. He was younger, modern in his thinking, the kind of physician who read the latest medical journals from Germany and France, who spoke with absolute certainty about the nature of women's afflictions. When she entered his office, he didn't waste time on pleasantries. He listened as she described her symptoms, his pen scratching against paper, occasionally nodding with grim recognition. Hysteria, he finally pronounced, the word hanging in the air between them like a diagnosis of doom. A fairly common condition in women of your station, I'm afraid. The female nervous system is delicate, you see, far more susceptible to disturbance than the male constitution. She'd heard this before, but something in his manner suggested he didn't merely accept this as fact. He understood it, could trace it to its physiological roots. The uterus, he continued, warming to his subject, exercises a profound influence over the entire female system. When left unsatisfied, when its essential functions are thwarted, it becomes restless. This restlessness manifests as precisely the symptoms you describe. Adelaide felt her face flush, unsatisfied. She was a respectable married woman. Surely he didn't mean, but he was already gesturing toward a screen in the corner of his office. If you'll disrobe and lie on the examination table, we'll begin your treatment immediately. The condition responds quite well to proper intervention, particularly when caught early. She changed behind the screen, her heart hammering against her ribs. When she emerged, wrapped in a simple white sheet, Dr. Carter had already begun arranging his instruments on a small tray. There was a bottle of oil, something that smelled of lavender and roses. There were cloths. There was an expression on his face of professional concentration, utterly devoid of impropriety. The examination table was leather and cold despite the summer heat. She lay back, her upper body still covered, only the area below her waist exposed. Dr. Carter was all business, his manner carrying the weight of medical authority. He positioned himself between her legs and began to apply the scented oil with measured, deliberate movements. At first it felt clinical, cold, medicinal. But then his fingers began to move with greater purpose, rubbing in circular motions, pressing deeper, finding sensitive points she didn't know existed. She wanted to speak, to object, but no words came. Dr. Carter had not asked permission for any of this. He simply proceeded as though this were any standard medical examination. His movements quickened slightly. The sensation building within her was unlike anything she'd experienced, alarming and overwhelming. Her breathing became shallow, her muscles began to contract involuntarily, and then a sudden, violent release. Her back arched off the table, her hands grasped the edges. For a moment everything dissolved into sensation, into an explosion of pressure and relief, and something so foreign to her lived experience that she couldn't have named it if her life depended on it. When it was over, she lay gasping, her skin flushed, her entire body trembling with something that felt dangerously close to pleasure. Dr. Carter stepped back, already writing notes on his clipboard as though he'd merely checked her reflexes. "Excellent," he said, almost to himself. "The paroxysm was quite pronounced. You should see immediate relief from your symptoms. I'd like to see you again next Thursday. Twice weekly for the next month would be optimal." She dressed in silence, her mind reeling. What had just happened? What had he done to her? And why did she feel the strangest urge to comply with his recommendation to return? If you enjoy these dark histories, if there's something fascinating about how brilliantly wrong-educated people can be, leave a like and subscribe. Ring the notification bell too. I genuinely want to know where you're listening from. I'm curious which parts of the world find this particular brand of medical catastrophe most interesting. Comment below, tell me your location. Now let's understand how an entire profession managed to spend 2 centuries giving women orgasms while maintaining a completely straight face about it. The concept didn't emerge from Victorian thought. Long before Dr. Carter's clinic existed, before London's gas lamps illuminated its streets, the ancient world had already decided what was fundamentally wrong with women. The Egyptians believed it first, but the Greeks gave it shape and name. Hippocrates, the man Western medicine reveres as its father, looked at women who suffered from anxiety, seizures, and various nervous complaints, and came to a simple conclusion. Their internal organs were literally travelling. Hystera, the Greek word for uterus. Hippocrates theorized that when a woman remained unwed, when her womb received no regular attention from a man, the organ would grow restless. It would detach from its proper moorings and wander through her body cavity like a lost animal. As it moved, it would press against other organs, trapping nerves, disturbing blood flow, causing a cascade of symptoms that seemed to strike randomly across the female body. Plato took this concept further. He described the uterus not as a mere organ, but as an animal within an animal, a creature possessed of its own will and desires, desperate to fulfill its reproductive destiny. If a woman thwarted this desire, if she remained barren, her uterus would become angry. It would rebel, and the woman would suffer for this biological insubordination. The cure seemed obvious to ancient physicians: marriage and pregnancy. Satisfy the womb's needs and the woman would be cured. This wasn't cruelty dressed as medicine. It was logic, as ironclad as geometry. Women's bodies had a purpose. If that purpose went unfulfilled, of course something would go wrong. The surprise wasn't that women became hysterical. The surprise was that so many didn't. By the Renaissance, something had shifted. Physicians had begun to question the literal truth of the wandering womb theory. Dissections of female cadavers revealed that the uterus didn't actually move around the body. It was anchored in place by various ligaments and structures. There was no mechanism by which it could travel. But here's where history takes a turn toward the truly absurd. They kept the diagnosis anyway. Even as medical knowledge advanced, even as anatomy became more precise, hysteria remained. It simply expanded. If it wasn't a wandering womb causing the problem, it was something else. Something about the female reproductive system's inherent instability. The symptoms remained vague enough to encompass almost anything. Nervousness, hysteria. Insomnia, hysteria. Muscle spasms, definitely hysteria. Shortness of breath, hysteria. Loss of appetite, absolutely hysteria. Irritability, the very definition of hysteria. There was also a particularly circular diagnosis: sexual frigidity combined with sexual forwardness. A woman could be hysterical for showing too much sexual interest or too little. She could be hysterical for being too emotional or for being too cold. The condition was infinitely elastic, capable of absorbing any behaviour that didn't align with the narrow parameters of what a respectable woman should be. By the Victorian era, hysteria had become the catch-all diagnosis for female discontent, and physicians began to develop a comprehensive theory of why women were so prone to these nervous disorders. Thomas Sydenham, an English physician, estimated that hysteria was the most common disease after fever itself, affecting approximately 1/4 of all women in the population. 1/4. That's not a disease. That's most of the female experience being pathologized. The Victorian medical establishment had developed an elaborate theory about female physiology that would be laughable if the consequences hadn't been so extensive. Women, they believed, were fundamentally different creatures from men, more delicate, more nervous, more sensitive. The female constitution was built differently, organized around reproductive capacity rather than intellectual or physical performance. The uterus, they taught medical students, was the center of the female body. Everything else, the nervous system, the brain, the heart, was subordinate to it. This wasn't discussed in vague philosophical terms. Victorian medical textbooks provided detailed explanations of how the uterus sent signals throughout the female body, how it influenced mood, energy, digestion, mental clarity. A woman's entire personality and capability were theoretically tethered to her reproductive system. The implication was clear. Women weren't meant for strenuous intellectual work. They weren't meant for physical exertion. They weren't meant for independence. They were meant to fulfill their reproductive function, and any deviation from this natural role would result in nervous derangement. Medical school lectures reinforced this framework relentlessly. Students learned that the female body was essentially unstable, prone to nervous collapse, vulnerable to sudden derangement. The female reproductive system was presented as a source of danger, not just to the woman herself, but to society. An unsatisfied woman was a threat. A frustrated woman was a liability. An educated woman, supposedly taxing her reproductive organs by thinking too much, was committing a form of bodily betrayal. The theories extended into minutiae. Heavy menstruation wasn't a natural biological process, it was a sign of hysteria. Absence of menstruation was also hysteria. Irregular cycles, hysteria. The entire reproductive process was pathologized, turned into a source of potential disease. Puberty was medically dangerous for girls. Motherhood was understood as healing only if it led to pregnancy. Single women who remained childless were viewed as medically at risk. This created a self-fulfilling medical prophecy. If you begin from the assumption that women are inherently nervous and prone to collapse, and you interpret all their complaints through that lens, then of course you'll find evidence everywhere supporting your theory. A woman reports difficulty sleeping? That's hysteria. She's anxious? Hysteria. She's irritable? Definitely hysteria. The diagnosis was infinitely flexible, capable of encompassing nearly any human experience a woman might report to a physician. Dr. William Acton, one of the most influential Victorian physicians, published his views on this matter with characteristic bluntness in 1857. The majority of women, happily for them, are not very much troubled with sexual feeling of any kind. This became medical doctrine. The idea that respectable women, and by respectable, they meant middle class and above, had no sexual desires whatsoever. They might tolerate sexual contact with their husbands as a marital duty, but the notion that they could experience pleasure, that they might have their own sexual needs, was considered not just unlikely, but medically impossible. A woman who admitted to sexual desire was by definition unrespectable, probably hysterical, possibly dangerous. This created a profound paradox at the heart of Victorian medical practice. Physicians acknowledged that hysteria affected millions of women. They documented the symptoms meticulously. They recognized that these women were suffering. Yet they remained completely blind to the most obvious explanation. These women were experiencing the symptoms of sexual frustration while living in a society that denied female sexuality altogether. Here's where the treatment emerges, rising from this fog of contradictions and blindness like something inevitable and yet completely implausible. By the mid-19th century, physicians had settled on a standard treatment for hysteria: pelvic massage. The theory was straightforward within the logic of the time. If the uterus was the source of the disturbance, if it was creating nervous symptoms through its restlessness, then the solution was to induce what they called a hysterical paroxysm through manual manipulation of the genital region. A woman would make an appointment. She would arrive at the physician's office, often weekly, sometimes twice weekly. She would be led to an examination room and instructed to disrobe from the waist down while keeping her upper body and face covered for modesty. This detail is important. The face was covered so that both physician and patient could pretend this wasn't happening. The psychological mechanism of denial was built into the procedure. The physician would prepare his equipment. Bottles of scented oils, lavender and rose were most common, though some physicians used plain mineral oil. Clean cloths, and occasionally more elaborate devices designed to increase efficiency. He would begin the massage with broad, general movements, gradually becoming more focused. His hands would work in circular motions, pressing and releasing, finding sensitive areas, building intensity. The examination rooms themselves were designed with this psychological management in mind. High ceilings prevented any sense of intimacy. Detailed medical charts hung on the walls, keeping the visual focus on the clinical and scientific. A small table held instruments, reinforcing the medicinal nature of the space. Some offices featured screens that allowed the physician to approach from an angle that minimized eye contact, reducing any sense of personal engagement. Everything about the physical environment was engineered to support the pretense that nothing inappropriate was occurring. The appointment itself followed strict protocols. The woman would be instructed to remain quiet. If she vocalized discomfort, she was reassured that this was part of the therapeutic process. If she seemed to be experiencing pleasure, though this was never described in those terms, the physician would maintain his clinical demeanor, discussing the symptoms or the progress of treatment, as though commenting on a patient's blood pressure or heart rate. Some physicians kept detailed records documenting not just the treatment, but the patient's responses. These records, written in clinical language, meticulously describe the physical manifestations of orgasm without ever using that word. Muscle contractions, flushing, rapid respiration, vaginal lubrication. Each observation was recorded in the detached tone of scientific observation. Dr. Nathaniel Highmore, writing in 1660, described what he observed. The afflicted woman would experience violent contraction and relaxation of the muscles, accompanied by flushing of the face, a feeling of heat throughout the body, and in many cases a copious discharge of secretions followed by a state of profound relief and calm. This description is clinically accurate. It's also a description of an orgasm. But Victorian physicians could read this and not recognize it as such because the medical education they'd received had essentially erased female sexuality from existence. Medical textbooks showed detailed anatomical drawings of male reproductive anatomy, but treated the female version with remarkable vagueness. The clitoris was barely mentioned, if at all. Some texts labelled it as a vestigial organ, essentially useless in the adult woman, its function unclear. Others omitted it entirely. Consequently, physicians received their entire medical education without ever learning that this small structure was a centre of sexual sensitivity. They literally didn't know it existed in any functionally meaningful way. Dr. Russell Troll, writing in 1903, complained extensively about the treatment's demanding nature. Achieving hysterical paroxysm, he wrote, could require up to an hour and a half of continuous manipulation, making it among the most tedious and exhausting of medical procedures. The physical demand placed upon the physician is considerable. The language is extraordinary. A trained physician, with steady hands and medical authority, complaining about how physically tiring it is to manually stimulate women to orgasm. And he had no idea that's what he was complaining about. He genuinely believed he was performing a medical duty like setting broken bones or lancing boils. It was simply exhausting work, and the problem he identified, the exhaustion, would lead to one of history's most unintentionally ironic inventions. The scale of this practice became staggering. By the late 19th century, physicians estimated that 75% of American women suffered from hysteria. 75%. If we think about what that actually means, 3 out of every 4 women diagnosed with a disease, treated regularly, often weekly for years, the numbers begin to compound. In major cities like New York, Boston, and Philadelphia, certain physicians specialized exclusively in hysteria treatment. They became wealthy doing it. Dr. Taylor's practice in New York advertised complete relief from nervous exhaustion and female troubles, and employed multiple physicians on staff specifically to handle the volume of patients. The waiting rooms were full, the appointment books were packed months in advance. Some women appear in these books with entries for years, every Thursday at 2 o'clock, same time, same treatment, week after week, stretching into decades. The treatment wasn't limited to physicians' offices. Wealthy women could arrange for house calls, where a physician would come to the home, often with a nurse in attendance for propriety. But the most fashionable and most profitable option was the hydrotherapy resort. Specialized clinics throughout Europe advertise water-based hysteria treatments. The procedure involved directing powerful jets of pressurized water at the patient's genitals while she sat on specially designed chairs with cutout seats. The French called it la douche pelvienne, the pelvic shower. These weren't marginal medical facilities. They were luxury destinations. Bath in England became famous for its hysteria water treatments. Bodenbach in Germany marketed itself as a centre for female nervous complaints. Women would travel from across Europe to spend weeks at these establishments, receiving multiple treatments daily. The water cure was considered more refined than manual massage. less obviously intimate despite achieving identical results. An advertisement from Bodenbach in 1875 promised complete restoration of feminine vitality through the scientific application of thermal waters, combined with the latest electrical innovations. Women leave our facility renewed, revitalized, and restored to their proper role in society. Patient testimonials described miraculous transformations. One woman wrote about feeling invigorated beyond measure after her treatment course. Another described returning home with her spirits entirely restored, and her husband noting a remarkable return to my wife's cheerfulness and capacity for domestic duties. Of course they felt invigorated. They'd been receiving regular orgasms in a society where sexual pleasure for women was supposed to be impossible, unthinkable, forbidden. The relief wasn't just physical, it was psychological, a rare form of accepted pleasure, medicalized and therefore acceptable. The entire system was built on this exquisite ignorance. The woman knew something was happening. At some level, she understood that these appointments met some need in her. The patient testimonials hint at this understanding, though it's buried under layers of acceptable medical language, but she couldn't articulate it. To articulate it would be to admit she had sexual feelings, which meant she was unrespectable, which meant she was the problem, not her uterus. The physicians had no idea at all. They were genuinely performing what they believed to be medicine. They were maintaining professional distance through clinical language and the strategic placement of sheets. They went home to wives they believed had no sexual desires. They attended medical conferences and presented papers on the efficacy of different techniques for inducing paroxysms, never once questioning why they were doing this. Then came the problem that would accelerate everything. The doctor's hands were tired. By the 1880s, as hysteria diagnosis had spread and the volume of patients had grown exponentially, some physicians began to experience occupational strain. A man doing pelvic massage on dozens of women per week, sometimes for over an hour per patient, develops serious hand and wrist problems. The repetitive motion causes inflammation, arthritis, and genuine pain. Dr. Joseph Mortimer Granville, a London physician, was one such sufferer. His hands were giving out from the relentless demand for pelvic massage. He was a smart man, educated, innovative, and he was exhausted. In 1883, he did what any clever engineer would do when faced with repetitive manual labour. He mechanized it. He developed a device called the percussor, powered by an electromagnetic engine, capable of producing rapid vibrations at adjustable speeds. The vibrations could be delivered through various attachments, but the principle was the same: let the machine do what had previously required a doctor's hands. Granville was initially adamant that his device was meant for treating male muscle disorders, but physicians working with female patients quickly recognized its application. Why spend an hour massaging when you could achieve the same result in 10 minutes with a vibrator? The technology spread rapidly through the medical profession. By 1900, vibrators were being manufactured by dozens of companies. The Weiss Company catalogue from 1906 offered more than 20 different models, each with specific claims about efficiency, design, and therapeutic benefit. There were handheld vibrators in various sizes. There were devices on mechanical stands. There were floor models with multiple attachments. There were vibrators that could be attached to furniture, specially designed chairs with built-in vibrating mechanisms for patient comfort. The Chattanooga vibrator advertised that it could relieve hysteria symptoms in under 10 minutes. The White Cross electric vibrator promised the essence of life itself delivered to your very door. These weren't niche medical devices. By 1900, the vibrator had become the 5th most common electrical appliance in American homes, more widespread than electric fans or electric lights in many communities. Sears and Roebuck, the dominant retailer of the era, advertised vibrators in their general catalogue. The 1908 Sears catalogue featured a home vibrator, with text describing it as very useful and satisfactory for home service. There were no elaborate euphemisms. It was marketed alongside toasters, sewing machines, and other labour-saving devices for the home. This is where we enter truly surreal territory. Vibrators were being advertised in women's magazines, sold through mainstream retail, featured in household product catalogues. One 1910 advertisement showed a woman using a vibrator on her face, with text proclaiming, "Vibration is life. The secret of the ages has been discovered in vibration. Great scientists tell us that we owe not only our health, but even our life strength to this wonderful force. The advertisements maintained the fiction of respectability through careful language. They emphasized efficiency, modern science, and the benefits to female health. They spoke of nervous relief, restoration of vitality, and renewed capacity for domestic duties. They were brilliantly misleading because they were technically accurate while being profoundly deceptive about what was actually happening. And through it all, nobody involved seemed to understand what was occurring. Physicians published detailed clinical papers about the technique of inducing hysterical paroxysms. Medical journals carried advertisements for the latest vibrator models. Women purchased home vibrators and used them regularly, often with their husband's knowledge and approval, because it was a legitimate medical treatment. The cognitive dissonance must have been extraordinary. A physician would spend his afternoon inducing paroxysms in female patients. He would write detailed clinical notes describing the muscular contractions, the flushing, the relief. Then he would go home to his wife, whom he believed had no sexual desires, and maintain conjugal relations with the confidence that he was engaging in a purely reproductive act, not a sexual one. John Harvey Kellogg, the cereal magnate, embodied this contradiction perfectly. He operated a large sanitarium where he treated hysteria and other nervous complaints with vibrators and electrical devices. Simultaneously, he crusaded against masturbation as a dangerous evil that would destroy the moral and physical health of the nation. He wrote extensively about the horrors of self-abuse, recommending clitoridectomy as a cure for girls who engaged in masturbation. He advocated for male circumcision to make masturbation physically more difficult. He never made the connection between the orgasms he was inducing medically and the sexual pleasure he was simultaneously warning against. The same act performed by a physician with clinical intent was healing. The same act performed by a woman on herself was dangerous and depraved. The distinction wasn't based on the physical reality. It was based entirely on context and intention, or at least the claimed intention. And yet, some women understood. They might not have been able to articulate it in the language of sexuality. That language didn't exist for respectable women, but they understood that these appointments met a need. The evidence is scattered through the historical record, hidden in the gaps between medical terminology and human reality. Diary entries from the era contain hints. One anonymous woman wrote in 1892, "My weekly appointments with Dr. Harrison have quite restored my spirits. I find myself looking forward to Thursday afternoons with great anticipation, though I couldn't explain to anyone why." Another woman noted that the treatment, though peculiar in nature, provides a relief and restoration unlike any tonic or medicine prescribed to me. Women recommended their physicians to each other. Networks formed. Certain doctors became known among women as particularly effective at hysteria treatment. Some physicians maintained waiting lists with dozens of women requesting appointments. The demand wasn't coming from physicians pushing treatment on reluctant patients. The patients were actively seeking it out, recommending it to friends, maintaining regular appointments over years and decades. One letter from a wealthy Boston woman to a friend explicitly recommends a particular physician's practice, noting that his treatments have a most remarkable effect on one's disposition and energy. Another woman writes that she has transferred her care to a different physician after finding his treatment method superior, suggesting that women were shopping around, comparing practitioners, seeking the most effective providers. Husbands occasionally complained about the frequency of these appointments or expressed curiosity about the nature of the treatment, yet they seemed unable to object to what was medically prescribed. If a doctor recommended weekly or twice-weekly visits, who was a husband to argue? The physician was the authority. The treatment was medically sanctioned. To suggest something improper was occurring would have been to cast doubt on the medical establishment itself. Some women requested female physicians or complained when regular practitioners were unavailable, wanting continuity of care with someone they were comfortable with. Others carefully maintained the appointments within their household schedules, sometimes without their husband's knowledge, finding ways to fit multiple visits into their social calendars. The physical effects of the treatment were undeniable. Women reported feeling invigorated, restored to health, capable of managing their domestic duties with renewed energy. They genuinely felt better, emotionally, physically, spiritually. The relief was profound and noticeable enough that they would travel significant distances to maintain access to their physicians, that they would recommend them enthusiastically to other women, that they would endure the costs and the time commitment willingly. For women whose sexual desires had been systematically denied, whose sexuality had been declared non-existent, whose bodies had been taught to them as instruments of reproduction rather than sources of pleasure, this treatment represented something extraordinary. It was the only space in their lives where their bodies were attended to with this intensity, where sensation mattered, where something that felt undeniably good was happening, even if it couldn't be named. The medical establishment's ignorance of female sexuality, maintained through deliberate omission in medical education, had allowed something remarkable to occur. For decades, millions of women received regular sexual satisfaction through the medical system, while everyone involved maintained the fiction that nothing sexual was happening. It's almost impossible to overstate how much cultural work had to go into maintaining this blindness. Medical schools taught anatomy through dissection and detailed drawings, yet the clitoris was omitted or dismissed. Textbooks that could describe male reproductive anatomy in elaborate detail would describe female anatomy in vague generalities. Medical professors lectured about hysteria's symptoms and treatment without once suggesting that the symptoms might relate to sexuality or that the treatment was inducing sexual response. This wasn't accidental. This was systematic educational erasure. Students were literally trained not to see. They learned to apply the vocabulary of clinical detachment to procedures that were fundamentally sexual, without anyone ever using that word. The consequences extended far beyond mere ignorance about hysteria treatment. This foundational misunderstanding of female sexuality had led physicians to perform procedures that now seem monstrous. Dr. Isaac Baker Brown, president of the Medical Society of London, removed the clitorises of patients, young girls in some cases as young as 10 years old, to treat hysteria and prevent masturbation. He called it a cure. His colleagues initially supported him. It took years before he was expelled from the Medical Society, and even then it was primarily because he operated without explicit consent, not because the procedure itself was questioned. Other physicians cauterized the clitoris with acid to prevent self-abuse. Still others prescribed extreme measures, isolation, cold water baths, exercise regimens designed to exhaust the patient. All of these were attempts to treat a disease that didn't exist using methods based on the false premise that female sexuality didn't exist. Meanwhile, the hysteria treatment industry became economically significant. By 1915, American physicians were earning an estimated $18 million annually from hysteria treatments. $18 million in 1915, which translates to roughly $450 million in modern currency. This wasn't a marginal practice. This was mainstream medicine generating enormous profit. Manufacturers capitalized on the opportunity, producing increasingly elaborate and specialized devices. The vibratile, introduced in 1908, came with multiple attachments designed for treating various female complaints. There were small attachments for delicate work, larger attachments for broader application, curved attachments designed for specific anatomical features. Each claimed to offer superior therapeutic benefit. The Pulsicon hand crank model from 1890 provided vibration without electricity, useful in locations without reliable electrical infrastructure. Some devices were permanently installed in treatment chairs, which meant that the vibration was built into the furniture itself. Women would sit in these chairs, which looked like ordinary furniture, and receive treatment through the built-in mechanism. The affluent could purchase home models for personal use, though the marketing language insisted this was for general health and vitality, not for any specifically sexual purpose. One luxury model came in a wooden cabinet, beautifully crafted, designed to sit in a lady's bedroom as discreetly as any other piece of furniture. The advertising copy promised health benefits, improved circulation, and restored nervous function. The entire ecosystem, the diagnosis, the treatment, the devices, the marketing, the cultural assumptions that made it all possible, had become a massive, profitable industry built on systematic misunderstanding of female bodies and deliberate erasure of female sexuality. Then everything changed, and the catalyst came from an unexpected direction. Sigmund Freud isn't generally remembered as a liberator of female sexuality, and for good reason. His theories about penis envy, his insistence that healthy women should experience only vaginal orgasms, not clitoral ones, his various pronouncements about women, these were deeply problematic and damaging. But on one crucial point, Freud broke with Victorian medical consensus. He acknowledged that women had sexual desires. More importantly, he recognized that hysteria might have psychological, rather than purely physical causes. He suggested that symptoms of hysteria could be rooted in emotional trauma, in repressed experiences, in psychological rather than physiological dysfunction. This wasn't revolutionary thinking by modern standards, but in the context of late 19th century medicine, it was radical. Freud's ideas began to shift how the medical profession thought about hysteria. If the condition was psychological rather than purely physical, then manual pelvic massage might not be the appropriate treatment. Psychoanalysis might be more effective. The entire therapeutic framework began to shift. Younger physicians began to question the traditional approach. Medical conferences started hosting debates about whether hysteria was being properly understood. The certainty that had characterized physician attitudes toward hysteria treatment began to fracture, just slightly at first, then more significantly. By the 1920s, American psychiatry was moving away from hysteria as a primary diagnosis. Psychiatric journals began publishing articles questioning the validity of the diagnosis, suggesting that what had been labelled hysteria might be better understood through psychological frameworks. The pendulum was swinging. Papers appeared comparing the efficacy of psychoanalytic approaches versus mechanical treatment. Some physicians began to openly question whether the traditional treatment methods were truly therapeutic or merely symptomatic. The medical establishment was beginning to recognize that something was wrong with their fundamental understanding of the condition. Not that they were giving women orgasms, they still hadn't connected those dots, but that the entire framework upon which hysteria treatment was built might be faulty. If the condition wasn't purely physical, if it wasn't caused by an unstable uterus or insufficient sexual satisfaction in the reproductive sense, then what was it actually treating? But the real nail in the coffin came from an unexpected source: early pornographic films. In the 1920s, as moving picture technology evolved, underground films began circulating that showed explicitly sexual content. These weren't artistic endeavours. They were called stag films, and they were crude, direct depictions of sexual acts for male consumption. They were illegal, underground, explicitly transgressive. They circulated in private settings, men's clubs, late-night screenings, private collections, and they featured women using vibrators for clearly sexual purposes. The moment vibrators appeared in stag films, they were transformed. The device that had been respectable, medical, advertised in mainstream magazines, suddenly became associated with explicit sexuality. The dual nature of the vibrator, that it had always been a sexual device, just one that people were pretending was medical, was suddenly impossible to deny. The implication was unavoidable. If vibrators were being used for sexual purposes in pornographic films, then what exactly had physicians been doing with them in their offices? The question didn't need to be asked explicitly. The answer was suddenly, horrifyingly obvious. Within a few years, vibrators essentially disappeared from mainstream medical practice. The Sears catalogue dropped vibrator advertisements by 1925, not gradually, but seemingly overnight, pulled from circulation as though acknowledging their existence had been an embarrassment. Medical journals stopped featuring them. Advertisements that had run for decades vanished. Physicians quietly abandoned the practice of pelvic massage. The devices that had been sitting in medical offices across the country, used on thousands of women weekly, were discreetly disposed of. What had been a standard medical treatment became taboo almost overnight. The speed of this transformation is striking, not because the practice changed, but because the context changed. The same technology, performing the same function, suddenly became impossible to justify in medical terms once the sexual nature of what was happening could no longer be denied. Hysteria as a formal diagnosis survived another few decades. It wasn't officially removed from the psychiatric manual until 1952, when it was replaced by more specific diagnoses like conversion disorder. But it never regained its former prominence. The diagnosis that had affected millions of women, that had driven a massive industry, that had been the most common reason for women to visit physicians, essentially vanished. Its legacy, however, persisted. Women reporting medical concerns continued to be dismissed as hysterical. The term became a shorthand for dismissing women's experiences, for suggesting that female complaints were emotional rather than physiological, subjective rather than objective, imaginary rather than real. The specific diagnosis disappeared, but the underlying assumption that women's suffering could be dismissed as neurotic or emotional remained deeply embedded in medical culture. It wasn't until the 1960s, with the work of researchers like William Masters and Virginia Johnson, that female sexuality was approached with any real scientific rigor. Masters and Johnson conducted their famous studies of human sexual response, documenting through careful observation and measurement what women's bodies actually experienced during sexual arousal and orgasm. They weren't discovering something new. They were finally documenting what had been happening in Victorian physicians' offices for over a century. What those research studies confirmed was exactly what those Victorian women knew but couldn't say. The hysterical paroxysm that physicians had been inducing was simply an orgasm. The response documented so carefully in medical literature, the muscular contractions, the flushing, the rapid breathing, the sensation of release followed by profound relaxation, was a textbook description of female sexual response. The numbers, when you step back and look at them, are staggering. If we take conservative estimates, if we assume that only 10% of adult women in major American cities received hysteria treatment between 1850 and 1920, and that they received an average of 20 treatment sessions each over their lifetimes, we're talking about tens of millions of medically administered orgasms, possibly hundreds of millions. This wasn't a marginal practice affecting a small subset of women. This was mainstream medicine touching the lives of an enormous portion of the female population. Some women received treatment weekly for decades. Some received treatment twice weekly. Some would travel to European spas and receive multiple treatments daily for weeks at a time. The cumulative number of sexual experiences facilitated by the medical system, experienced by women who were supposed to be incapable of such experiences, is almost impossible to quantify. What's most striking is how the entire medical profession managed to participate in this without recognizing what was happening. This wasn't fringe practitioners or marginal clinics. These were respected physicians trained at prestigious medical schools, publishing in respected journals, treating wealthy patients in elite urban practices. They had access to detailed anatomical knowledge. They had years of medical training. They had first-hand experience with human bodies and human responses. Yet they remained blind because the culture around them had constructed an elaborate framework of denial around female sexuality. The blindness wasn't accidental. It was systematic, maintained through careful omission in medical education, reinforced through professional consensus, protected by cultural assumptions so fundamental that they seemed like simple facts of nature. Every element of the system worked to maintain the fiction. Medical textbooks that omitted the clitoris or dismissed it as vestigial. Educational curricula that didn't mention female sexual pleasure. Professional terminology that allowed physicians to describe sexual acts in purely clinical language. Architectural arrangements of examination rooms, the sheet placement, the covered face, the specific positioning that allowed everyone to maintain the pretense that nothing sexual was occurring. It was a conspiracy of silence, except everyone involved actually believed what they were saying. The physicians genuinely thought they were treating a disease. The patients, while perhaps understanding at some intuitive level what was happening, couldn't articulate it in a language that existed. The medical journals published detailed descriptions of the procedures without anyone saying the forbidden word. This history matters profoundly because it reveals something disturbing about how medicine works. Medical practice isn't immune to cultural bias. It isn't protected by scientific training from the assumptions of the society it exists within. Brilliant, educated, well-intentioned physicians can be so blinded by cultural consensus that they perform the same action thousands of times without recognizing its true nature. The treatment of hysteria represents perhaps history's most elaborate example of collective denial, but it's not unique. Throughout medical history, physicians have failed to recognize obvious truths because those truths contradicted cultural assumptions. Women's pain has been systematically minimized because women were assumed to be more prone to exaggeration. Symptoms have been dismissed as psychological because they didn't fit existing diagnostic categories. Treatments have been denied because they contradicted beliefs about what women should want or need. The vibrator's journey from respected medical device to taboo sexual implement reveals the fragility of medical legitimacy. The device didn't change. Its function didn't change. What changed was the cultural context in which it existed. Once the sexual nature of the act became undeniable, the entire medical edifice supporting it collapsed almost instantly. This reminds us that medical practice exists at the intersection of science and culture. Sometimes they align, sometimes they're in direct contradiction. When they conflict, culture often wins, at least temporarily, and the cost of that victory falls disproportionately on the vulnerable. For the women who sought treatment for hysteria, there was perhaps an irony worth noting. In a society that denied them sexuality, that told them respectable women had no sexual desires, that confined them to narrow domestic roles, the medical system inadvertently provided something they couldn't get elsewhere: regular, sanctioned sexual satisfaction. It was wrapped in medical language. It was performed by authority figures who didn't admit what they were doing. It was structured within systems designed to maintain propriety and deny the obvious. But it was sex, and for many women, it was the only sex they would ever experience. The treatment ended not because physicians suddenly understood what they were doing, but because the culture could no longer maintain the necessary denial. Once vibrators appeared in pornographic films, once the sexual purpose of the devices became impossible to ignore, the entire system of pretense collapsed. The same physicians who had been treating hysteria patients weekly suddenly stopped, because the cultural context that made the practice possible had shifted irreversibly. What happened to those women afterward is part of the larger story of how women's health concerns came to be systematized, dismissed. Without the medical framing that had made regular sexual satisfaction acceptable, women returned to the reality of living in a society that denied their sexuality. The relief they had found evaporated, but the memory of it remained, even if it couldn't be articulated. Some women likely experienced what we might now recognize as withdrawal or loss. For years, perhaps decades, they had received regular sexual attention, had experienced pleasure, had found relief in these appointments, and suddenly it ended. Not because their condition had been cured, there was no condition to cure, hysteria had never been a real disease, but because society's willingness to maintain the pretense had collapsed. The implications of this sudden cessation were profound. Women who had understood, at some level, what these treatments were providing, who had structured their weeks around these appointments, who had looked forward to them with anticipation, suddenly found themselves without access to this form of physical pleasure. The physicians didn't explain why they were stopping. They simply ended the treatments, moved on to other specialties, perhaps felt a mixture of relief and embarrassment at what they'd been doing without understanding it. The cultural amnesia was nearly total. Within a generation or two, the fact that physicians had been routinely treating women's conditions with stimulation and vibration was treated as almost unbelievable. Historical accounts written in the mid-20th century expressed bewilderment at how such practices could ever have been considered medical. The writers seemed unable to imagine how intelligent, educated people could have engaged in such obvious misconduct while maintaining they were practicing medicine. This cultural erasure served a purpose. It allowed everyone involved to pretend it hadn't really happened, or that if it had, it was aberration rather than standard practice. The work of a few misguided practitioners, rather than systematic medical treatment affecting millions of women. The machinery of denial that had initially prevented physicians from recognizing what they were doing now prevented society from acknowledging that it had ever occurred on such a massive scale. Yet the women knew. They remembered. Some wrote about it later, though necessarily in guarded language, using medical terminology they'd learned from their physicians. Others never spoke of it, maintaining the silence throughout their lives, carrying the memory of those appointments as a private understanding of something the world insisted wasn't real. The next time someone dismisses a woman's medical complaint as hysteria, or anxiety, or emotional rather than physical, remember this history. For over 2 centuries, the medical profession gave women orgasms while maintaining that female sexuality didn't exist. They were so blinded by cultural assumptions that they couldn't recognize the obvious. They performed this blind treatment thousands of times daily without understanding what they were doing. This wasn't ignorance in the sense of lack of information. The anatomical knowledge existed. The information was available. This was chosen ignorance, cultural ignorance, systematic ignorance, built into education, reinforced by professional consensus, protected by everyone's mutual need to maintain the pretense. Think about the mechanisms through which this blindness was maintained. Medical textbooks existed. Detailed anatomical drawings were produced. Physicians dissected cadavers and studied anatomy. Yet the most sensitive part of female anatomy, the clitoris, was either omitted, misidentified, or explicitly dismissed as insignificant. Medical students graduated from prestigious institutions without ever learning that the clitoris had any functional purpose beyond reproduction. This wasn't accidental. It was systematic erasure from the very education system, supposed to teach physicians how human bodies worked. The language of medicine itself became a vehicle for denial. By creating clinical terminology for what was happening, paroxysm, therapeutic induction, hysteric response, physicians could discuss the procedures in academic journals, in medical conferences, in written case studies, all without ever using language that acknowledged the sexual nature of what was occurring. A physician could write a detailed paper describing the technique for inducing paroxysms, complete with specific instructions about pressure and motion and duration, and present it to colleagues as though discussing blood pressure measurement techniques. The very architecture of the examination rooms reinforced the denial. The sheet placement that covered the woman's face wasn't just about her modesty. It was about both parties maintaining the ability to pretend this wasn't happening. If you can't see someone's face, if you're not maintaining eye contact, if the environment is clinical and cold and professional, then perhaps you can convince yourself that the most intimate physical contact you're having with another person is purely medical in nature. Professional consensus made this all possible. When colleagues weren't questioning the practice, when medical journals were publishing articles about it matter-of-factly, when prestigious physicians were recommending it, when other doctors' offices had the same setup and procedures, it became normalized. Deviation from the established practice seemed risky. Questioning it seemed unnecessary. Everyone was doing it this way, so it must be correct. The power of peer consensus to blind people to obvious truths cannot be overstated. The vibrator itself survived this history. After disappearing from medical practice in the 1920s, it re-emerged in the 1960s and beyond as an explicitly sexual device, marketed to women for purposes that no longer required medical justification. The device that had treated hysteria became a tool for female sexuality that could be discussed openly. The transformation from medical to sexual device wasn't actually a transformation at all. It was simply a shift in what people were willing to admit about what the device did. That shift matters, not because admitting the sexual purpose made the vibrator more valuable or more legitimate, but because it allowed the full truth to finally emerge. What physicians had been doing without understanding it could finally be named. What women had been experiencing without being able to articulate it could finally be acknowledged. The story of Victorian hysteria treatment isn't really about medical error, though there was plenty of that. It's about how culture shapes the boundaries of what people can perceive and acknowledge. It's about how systematic denial can persist across an entire profession for generations, maintained through omission and careful language and mutual agreement not to ask difficult questions. And it's a reminder that modern medicine, for all our advances, still exists within a culture. We still have blind spots. We still have areas where cultural assumptions override scientific evidence. We still have professional consensuses that might collapse under scrutiny. The difference is that now, hopefully, we're aware of the potential for this kind of blindness. We can look for it. We can question assumptions. We can resist the comfortable fiction that authority plus specialized knowledge equals understanding. The Victorian physicians weren't monsters. They weren't intentionally harming women. They were working within the framework their culture had constructed, following protocols their profession endorsed, acting on beliefs their education had instilled. And yet they were systematically misunderstanding what they were doing and why. That's perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this history, not the specific details of what happened, but the recognition that it could happen. That systems of knowledge, practiced by educated people with genuine good intentions, could be fundamentally mistaken about something they dealt with daily, and that the mechanism by which they maintained this mistake was so elegant, so systematic, that it took an explicit intrusion of sexual content, stag films of all things, to finally break through the denial. Consider what it means that pornography became the vehicle for truth, that it took the most stigmatized form of media, the most socially condemned artistic expression, to finally force the medical establishment to confront the obvious. The irony is almost too perfect. Hysteria treatment was so deeply embedded in denial that pornography, the ultimate representation of taboo sexuality, was the only thing crude enough, explicit enough, undeniable enough to break through the layers of medical and cultural pretense. Modern medicine likes to distance itself from this history, to position it as evidence of how far we've come, how much better our understanding is now. And in many ways that's true. We know more about female anatomy. We acknowledge female sexuality. Women physicians practice openly, bringing different perspectives to medical training and practice. But has the fundamental problem been solved? Have we actually addressed the mechanisms that allowed this kind of systematic blindness to persist? Or have we simply shifted the forms it takes? Women still report that their pain is dismissed, that their symptoms are attributed to anxiety or stress rather than investigated thoroughly, that they're labelled as hysterical in modern form, too emotional, too sensitive, too quick to blame medical causes for what might be psychological. The language has changed, but the underlying dismissal persists. Different diagnoses are being overused or misused now. Different assumptions are guiding medical practice in ways we don't yet recognise. We like to think medicine has progressed beyond such things, that modern physicians with better training and scientific methodology couldn't fall into such traps. Probably that's true in aggregate, but individually, in specific cases, with specific populations. The history of medicine suggests we should remain humble about what we think we understand. The hysteria treatment story teaches us something crucial about the limits of expertise and the power of cultural assumption. These weren't incompetent physicians. They were the best-trained doctors of their era, following protocols that had been developed by their most respected colleagues. They published their findings in medical journals. They were invited to lecture at universities. They were consulted by wealthy, educated people seeking the best medical care available. And yet they were systematically wrong about something fundamental that they engaged with daily, not through malice, not through stupidity, but through a perfect storm of cultural blindness, professional consensus, systematic educational omission, and the human capacity to see what we expect to see and miss what we're trained not to acknowledge. The vibrators that filled medical offices across America, that were purchased through Sears catalogues, that were displayed in medical journals, that were discussed in academic conferences, they all pointed to the same uncomfortable truth, but nobody wanted to see it. The cost of seeing it would have been admitting that women had sexuality, that the medical profession had been performing sexual acts on women for decades, that the fundamental framework through which medicine understood women was based on false premises. So instead, the entire history was erased. Within 50 years of the practice ending, it was almost impossible to find in medical literature. It was treated as an embarrassing footnote, something that happened to medicine in the past, but that modern medicine had moved beyond. The historians and sociologists and physicians who eventually researched this history found they had to piece it together from scattered references, old medical journals, patient testimonies, and devices still sitting in museums. What we're left with is a historical episode so bizarre, so counterintuitive, that it almost seems fabricated. The idea that millions of women received medical treatment that was explicitly sexual in nature, all while everyone involved maintained that female sexuality didn't exist, contradicts our basic assumptions about how knowledgeable people behave. It seems like something that couldn't have happened, and yet it did. For over 70 years at peak practice spanning continents, involving thousands of practitioners and millions of patients, it was systematized, professionalized, marketed, discussed in academic publications, performed in prestigious medical institutions. And almost nobody recognized what was actually occurring, yet somehow the truth persisted. Despite the systematic efforts to deny, omit, and erase the reality of these treatments, the record remained. Women's memories, the devices themselves, the medical journals and case studies, the patient testimonials, all of it survived. And eventually, when culture shifted enough that the sexual nature of these practices could no longer be denied, the truth emerged. This persistence of truth against systematic denial is perhaps the most encouraging aspect of the story. No matter how comprehensive the attempt to deny reality, to erase it from official records, to pretend it never happened, the evidence remains. The vibrators survived in museums and private collections. The medical journals remained in archives. The women who experienced these treatments passed down their memories, even if only in coded language or diary entries. History doesn't disappear just because we refuse to acknowledge it. It waits. It persists. And when the conditions change, when the cultural context shifts enough, the truth can finally emerge into the light. This is the final and perhaps most important lesson of the hysteria treatment history. Our blindness to obvious truths is not evidence that those truths don't exist. The fact that the medical profession couldn't see what it was doing doesn't mean it wasn't happening. The fact that everyone involved maintained they were engaging in medical practice doesn't mean they weren't engaging in something sexual. Reality doesn't wait for our permission to exist. Somewhere in these contemporary times, in modern medical practice, there are almost certainly equivalent blindnesses. Things that are happening regularly, that are being discussed in professional literature, that are being performed by educated practitioners in reputable institutions, that future generations will look back on with the same bewilderment we feel looking at Victorian hysteria treatment. We probably can't see what they are. That's the nature of cultural blindness. But they're there. The mechanisms that created the Victorian medical blindness are still present in medical education, still embedded in professional culture, still protected by the human capacity for systematic denial.